So we'll kick off and say thank you ever so much for joining us. This is the second of our Net Zero sessions as part of our Futures Forum. Welcome everybody. And today, as our opening speaker, our keynote for the day, we're delighted to welcome Hugh Knowles, who is the Co-Executive Director of Friends of the Earth for England, Wales and Northern Ireland. He is an activist and innovator, from stopping new open cast mines being opened to co-creating Buggy Air, a device to track infant exposure to air pollution. And he now specialises in using futures intelligence and innovation processes, which he will have to explain to me, to develop new ideas and experiment with tackling the big challenges of the 21st century. He's worked with Friends of the Earth for 4.5 years, and prior to that was at the Forum for the Future, looking at innovation for sustainability, and helped to bring us the wee man at the Eden Project. So physically defining average consumer electricals wastage throughout our individual lifetimes. So today we are really looking forward to hearing about all of his experience. I think that we'll all be able to learn a huge amount, and we're looking forward to hearing about the Friends of the Earth Green Jobs Report, which is particularly relevant because we've had the government's Green Jobs Task Force report come out this week as well. So hopefully we'll hear all about what the next generation should be hoping for in the next round of jobs. So I will hand over to you, Hugh. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Melanie, and thank you for being here. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all. So I know there are lots of other really interesting speakers today and interesting things that you can drop into. I'm going to try and spend about 20 minutes talking about the kind of bigger picture. I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey to my sort of green job. I'm going to talk a bit about the work that we actually do at Friends of the Earth and the current situation that we face as a kind of background to the broader picture on livelihoods when facing the climate and ecological crisis. So how I got to now, I graduated in the late 90s, which really dates me, in ecology and zoology, and was and still am incredibly passionate about the environment. I was very, very idealistic about what was going to happen next when I left university. I was going to walk straight into a saving the world job, which probably says something about the privilege of my background. When I graduated, there were about 4 environmental graduate jobs, and I applied for all of them and got none of them, and was fairly crushed by the experience. And I had a fairly good head start. I was a little bit less idealistic after that experience. I was told that what I really needed to do if I wanted to get into that career path was to get a master's, and I could not afford to do that at the time. So instead, I took a fairly extraordinary meandering path in my career. I did everything from assembling, working on an assembly line, making office furniture, to scraping chicken muck out of large chicken sheds, an experience which was fairly informative about how I feel about that method of raising animals. To sales for an IT company. And at the end of that, I was definitely less idealistic, but no less determined. And I was rescued by an organisation called the UK Centre for Economic and Environmental Development, and spent several years working there. And as Melanie mentioned, I spent a lot of time looking at electronic waste, so much time looking at electronic waste that I dreamt up a human figure that was made out of the amount of electronic waste that we would throw away in our lifetimes on current pathways, which turned into a sculpture which was 7.5 meters tall and weighed 3.5 tons, and sat on the South Bank for a while, scaring people before it was moved to the Eden Project. But again, not a particularly traditional career move. That then actually helped me end up working at Forum for the Future, which is an NGO that engages businesses, so mostly large multinationals, and trying to get them to change the way that they work and deal with the climate and ecological crisis. And I worked for many different organizations, engaging many different organizations over a period of 12 years there, with a really broad range of experience, and often not an entirely comfortable experience. Progress was often very slow, and it was often very frustrating, with occasional moments of real breakthrough. So I suppose the first thing I want to leave you with, which I learned, which I hope is useful to everybody here, is that a range of experience really helps you get into the livelihood that's a good match. It took me till I was about 33, I think, to even get close. I did not set out to do my current job. Even 3 years ago, I would have been surprised to end up where I am now. But there's another really key reason for having a range and experimenting in your career, and that is when faced with wicked problems, and we really are faced with wicked problems, a range of experience really helps you come at problems from different angles. Please don't worry, as I did, about people who got an early start straight into the career of their dreams. The research shows that those that experiment often catch up, and they bring a number of advantages in the fact that they've had that range of experience and can bring, all that thinking to the work that they do. So a little bit about Friends of the Earth and the kind of work that we do. For those of you who don't know Friends of the Earth, we have been around for 50 years. We are a grassroots environmental campaigning organisation. We have a history of being at the heart of campaigning, from whether that's preventing roads, protecting whales, forests, bees, the list goes on. And we always work with and for communities. We are also part of a global federation of organisations, well over 70 organisations all across the world. And that brings a really interesting perspective to our work. We have both that global perspective and the link up with those global organisations, all the way down to small groups of people working in communities. And that really does transcend that global to local perspective. I want to talk just very quickly about 3 examples of the kind of work that we do, the jobs that are involved in Friends of the Earth, 3 different approaches from our history. So one, years and years ago, the government said that household recycling wasn't possible. Friends of the Earth went and proved that it was possible. So one of our community groups started working in Bristol. They hired a van and they started collecting newspapers and glass, and showed that actually you can do it and it does work. And in fact, spun out a recycling company, a couple of recycling companies from that endeavour. And I think one of them is still around today. Off the back of that, we obviously helped change legislation around household recycling. And, despite some of the caveats around how recycling is done nowadays, that, came from someone starting with a van and collecting newspaper and glass. So it just shows that proving it can be done can be very powerful. Another example, and this is working on, big policy change, the Climate Change Act, which is a groundbreaking legislation that was passed through Parliament in 2008. And is still creating extraordinary ripples all around the world today. And a key part of that was tying government into achieving at least an 80% cut in greenhouse gases by 2050, and making sure that there was a mechanism to ratchet up those targets. Another example is our work that we've done on fracking, and this is very much community driven. So people who are embedded in communities started hearing about concern from local people around planning permission for fracking applications, and people were very concerned about what that was going to do to their villages and towns in the local area. We started working with them, and that's everything from making them a cup of tea and listening to them, to training them up, helping them talk to politicians, working on legal and planning aspects, talking at the national level, putting pressure on national government, and even sort of joining up communities across the world who are facing similar challenges. George Osborne, who was the Chancellor under David Cameron, said that there would be 4,000 fracking wells across the UK. That future has not happened, and that is down to the passion and commitment of all those communities across the UK, who tackled every single one of those fracking wells as they tried to develop it. And there's now a moratorium on fracking, and in fact, the UK government has admitted that fracking is basically dead within England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So that is great news, and just shows the power of something that comes from communities. And a lot of our work, and a lot of our power and our legitimacy and our resilience comes from the fact that we work with communities and we are supported by individuals. I joined Friends of the Earth as a director of innovation, and I took over as co-executive director in January after doing that job as an interim. Doing that job as an interim during a global pandemic was what I think some people call a growth experience. So the current situation, currently at Friends of the Earth, we have around 300 groups in our network, and we work largely as a catalyst, and we work on the national and international stage. As I've said, we can be in the Supreme Court challenging the Heathrow third runway, or we can be working with a community stopping a coal mine, or working globally looking at the funding of fossil fuels abroad. And we're also looking at things like doubling trees. If trees are a really great natural climate solution in terms of drawing down carbon out of the atmosphere, that's very, it's great at a global stage, but when it actually comes to planting the right trees in the right places, you have to be able to engage local people in that conversation and provide them with the data that helps them work out where to do that. So that's the kind of current work that we're up to at the moment. I wanted to, before talking about sort of what now and the importance of livelihoods in the face of this crisis, I wanted just to make a brief mention for the fact that I do a job share, which is not that common still, unfortunately. So I work part-time, I work 3 days a week, and I share the job with Miriam Turner. When we arrived at Friends of the Earth 4.5 years ago, we applied as two people. We both had young children, we both wanted to continue to play a large role in family life and do that role, and we applied to do that role as a job share. They're becoming more common, but if you are, if you're lucky enough to be able to get to the point where you can work part-time later in life, and my wife also does this, also works as a job share, then they are a really great option. It's just to sort of flag that as something that I hope happens a lot more in the future. So what now? And livelihoods in the climate and ecological crisis. I'm assuming that a lot of people who are here are relatively informed about what we're facing. But just to recap, we're obviously recovering or trying to recover from a global pandemic that still has really uncertain outcomes. We face huge economic challenges. We have the climate and ecological crisis, inequality, and multiple justice issues, which are obviously going to be exacerbated by the climate and ecological crisis. And that is an extremely potent mix. The pandemic has not possibly transformed society, but has definitely revealed its strengths and its weaknesses, and possibly shown us that human health is connected to environmental health and how we treat animals. And just one statistic on that I read the other day was that 4% of mammal biomass is wild. The rest is us and livestock. And that should all make us think very clearly about the way that we are treating this planet. And obviously the way that we treat animals and the way that we treat wild animals and the ecosystems around it have a huge impact on how pandemics emerge. But I think that has possibly given rise to more of a perspective on global shared challenges, that we can't just tackle these issues alone in our communities or in our nations. And hopefully people are learning the lesson from the fact that we can't treat the pandemic as a nation, and we need to treat it globally, that we also cannot treat the climate and ecological crisis in the same way. So in our 50th year, we face a really interesting inflection point. The good news is that most people agree that there is a problem and that we need to take action. So small sigh of relief there. We've largely decarbonised the electricity system in the UK. Coal has almost disappeared. Globally, the picture is far more complicated. But 10 years ago, UK coal going from our electricity system did not look likely. So that should give us all some hope. Technology and a lot of hard work and pressure and the price of renewables have dealt coal a real death blow. Despite this, progress is way, way too slow. So the context for a lot of what needs to happen in the next couple of years is that we agree that we need to take action, and it's all about the how. And this is really, really complicated. And in particular, it's how fast and it's how fair. And I want to come back to that point. So why is it so complicated? Because the next stage, now we've kind of, to some extent, decarbonized the electricity system, is it's much closer to people's homes and people's lives. It's about how we heat our houses. It's about what we eat. It's about what we drive. It's about how we use our land. And the political backdrop to that is quite interesting. The UK government could be considered one of the strongest ever on climate. And that is partly just because they have to be, given the context we face. But there is progress being made. That said, there are lots of gaps, lots of inconsistencies, and the gap between the rhetoric and the action is particularly alarming. We're also too reliant on the fact that technology will save us. And this is another really key piece of context for what I want to talk about in terms of livelihoods. Is it's particularly troubling because in recent history, many people have been marginalized or left behind by that assumption that technology is going to help us or just drive the change. One of the most instructive things is to look at another large, huge change that humanity went through, and that was the Industrial Revolution. Depending on which historian you talk to, it took between 25 to 150 years for the benefits of the Industrial Revolution to reach the average worker. We cannot afford for that. So it's complicated. It's going to be far more personal than it has been so far. We have little time, and we need to move fast, and we need to move fairly. That is the backdrop to all of this. and how we create livelihoods in this situation. The second thing, due to that backdrop, that I really want to leave you with is whatever you end up doing in this space, and there are so many jobs that need to be done to tackle a climate and ecological emergency, think about those who are currently most at risk, and that's those who are most at risk from current impacts, or those who are least likely to benefit or participate in the transition that we need to undergo, those who've been marginalized and oppressed so far. We really need to think about the transition with those people in mind right at the front of what we do, how we design, how we advocate. Because if we design for the mainstream, we will leave out all those people. We will leave out those at risk. We will leave out those marginalized. And that is not, tenable. It is not morally right. It is not practically right. And it is not politically right. If we design and advocate for the edges, it helps encompass everybody. So that is the kind of context for the sort of broader picture around livelihoods and the climate and ecological crisis. Melanie, you're telling me that I need to wrap up?
I'm not really. I thought that you were coming to a natural end, so I was getting myself prepared.
Just a couple more things to say.
Absolutely. So, you've got loads of time.
I just want to talk about the employment situation now. We're very aware at Friends of the Earth that there is considerable economic and psychological scarring, and that's from 2008. And from now, we know that younger generations have been really disproportionately affected by COVID in many ways. I'm sure that I don't need to tell this audience about that. And we are definitely aware of that impact. We know that the TUC recently found that young workers have suffered a bigger hit to their job prospects than any other group. And there are some deeply troubling trends within that. So just one quote that I want to leave you with, and this as well, was unemployment in BME people aged 16 to 24 soared from 18.2% to 27% between the final quarter of 2019 and the final quarter of 2020. But the thing is, there is a lot of work. We need to change how we heat our homes from natural gas. We have to install 600 times more heat pumps a year than we are currently installing. We need new business models. We need those that create value for communities. We need to double trees, restore peatland. We need to work closely with communities to do that. So the third thing I just want to leave you with is, when we look at the livelihoods needed to solve this crisis, think about it in terms of head, hand, and heart. And that's a phrase coined by academic David Graeber. For too long, we've elevated the knowledge economy jobs above all others. And for this transition, obviously, we need a revolution in the knowledge economy in the head area. But just as important are skilled manual jobs, hand, and caring and community jobs, heart. We need huge numbers of people changing housing stock. It's really vital work. We need community work to bring people together and make sure people are not left behind, and that's the heart aspects. And this is about why I could say livelihoods, not jobs. What we're really aiming for is meaningful livelihoods across head, hand, and heart within planetary boundaries. Green jobs doesn't really cut it. Friends of the Earth is campaigning to make sure that there is a rollout of an apprenticeship program that recognises this. 250,000 apprenticeships over 3 years, backed up by funding over 5 years, and to make sure that those apprenticeships are deployed in activities directly confronting the climate and ecological emergency. We're trying to play our own part directly within the organisation. We have a thriving youth programme called My World, My Home, and we've had 280 young people through that environmental leadership programme. And we're also taking on people through the Kickstart programme. So Friends of the Earth is at the heart of creating the change that's required and trying to do our own part within the organisation itself. So what I want to the messages that I want to leave you with at the end of this to summarise is, first of all, a range of experience helps you, but it also helps us tackle the wicked problems that we need to face. Please think about those that are most being left behind. So think about the edges, think about those marginalised, oppressed, whatever role you end up doing, and think head, hand, heart, and what livelihoods look like, not just greener jobs. I really look forward, I think that's quite enough from me. I really want to hear from people in the audience and any questions you have. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. That was great. I love the messaging. So yes, for all of you out there, I hope that you enjoyed it. We have got that Q&A function. The net zero sessions and our futures forum, our attendees are never knowingly quiet. So please do not be shy. We've got one question in at the moment, but I know that there will be more out there. I will come to the questions as they come in, and I can see that they are ticking up now. And remember, you can upvote the questions as well, because we've got about 20 minutes. So we can really grill Hugh, while you've got the co-CEO of Friends of the Earth in front of you. Don't let him leave without having had a tough time from you all. I've got a couple of questions. It's all right. We're going to drain you of all of your knowledge and experience. I have got a couple of questions. So it really strikes me the point that you made about job share, and it reminds me of the Green Party, and they had joint leadership of the Green Party. And I'm wondering, is this something more common at senior levels of environmentalism and kind of green industries, because of having to do so much collaborative effort over the last 30 years to try and get people to, the point that you're making about home recycling, for example? You can't do that just by banging people's heads together. You actually do need to engage in a dialogue, and it means creating quite a big forum. Do you think that that's something that's now embedded in the kind of the green sector?
Interesting. I mean, I think it does occur in the green sector, but it does occur in a lot of other places. I'm a massive advocate for job shares, but particularly for men going into job shares. And that's partly because originally it was sort of seen as a way for women to come back from maternity leave and still look after the children, which seems to be the wrong emphasis, really. It's about parents coming back from looking after your children. I think one of the things that I really do like about job shares, apart from that element, is that it moves away from this idea of sort of single actor with the answers somehow at the top of the organization. It's a more distributed leadership model and a more collaborative leadership model. And I do think that you're right. There is, whether I don't think that's just within the green movement, but across a range of places, people are starting to look at, different models of more collaborative leadership and moving away from the kind of hero leader model, which quite frankly has got us into a fair amount of trouble in the past. I could talk about job shares for ages, but I think there are other questions. So
there are other questions coming in. You should be able to see them as well. And so absolutely. I mean, you can see we've got the anonymous, Mr. or Miss Anonymous has got 5 votes on their question. So maybe if that's one that our audience are interested in being answered, we should kick off with that one.
Thank you for that question. That's absolutely at the heart of how Friends of the Earth works. So in our network, you will find groups that affiliate themselves directly with Friends of the Earth, or affiliate themselves with other environmental groups. That's everything from the Green New Deal network to Extinction Rebellion to Youth Strike. Friends of the Earth can be doing anything from helping Youth Strike set up their sound system in a Bristol event to coordinating huge numbers of groups across the country to make sure that elections, the recent huge number of elections we just had, and mayoral elections, really have climate and ecological crisis at their heart. So we definitely work in collaboration with a lot of those organizations. In terms of picking campaigning areas and topics to work together, there's definitely work at both the top and at the grassroots of organizations to make sure that we clearly understand what other organizations are working on, and there's definitely coordination there. Of course, it isn't always perfect, but there are a lot of coalitions that bring those organizations together. So for example, when we come to COP, the big UN climate change conference at the end of the year, there's a considerable amount of work that goes into coordinating the work across a number of different organizations in this area. And when it comes to things like the Environment Bill, there's a lot of work that goes on coordinating, because if we all came with all our different demands in those spaces, we would never get anything done. So yeah, there's a lot of work both at the grassroots and every other level in the organisation.
Thank you. I've just been reminded, for the benefit of our recordings, we should make sure that the questions are clear. That question was about the range of different, no, my fault, not yours. That was about the range of environmental organisations that there are in the UK, and how policy is influenced without different organisations kind of crossing over too much, although I imagine that actually collaboration on big issues actually gets the message home quite strongly, because I think if you see multiple well-known established charitable organisations or environmental organisations coming together, you can see that there is a strength of feeling around a common theme, as long as everyone can agree on that common theme. So one of the next questions is coming from John, which says, what's your message to Richard Branson in his quest for space tourism? Not just Richard Branson. I mean, there's a lot of multiple billionaires who have got lots and lots of money and seem to want to spend it on leaving the planet.
Yeah, I rather enjoyed the petition, which was not to have Jeff Bezos back once he'd left Earth orbit. I mean, I think this is possibly not as black and white as it first appears. I mean, generally, billionaire egos fighting to go into space is pretty troubling, and just the billionaire situation in terms of tax and societal contribution is something that I am, particularly troubled by. I don't know if anyone saw the recent expose on the amount of tax that most billionaires are paid in the US, but it is deeply shocking. And that just makes you question how on earth these people have the money to be able to afford this endeavor. And so I think that coming at the cost.
It used to just be nations, right? It would be a national effort or a collective of nations, and yet these individuals are now wealthier than some nations.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that wealth is, deeply troubling. The inequality of that aspect, the inequality aspect of all this, and then there's there is the huge consumption and carbon aspect of it, and there is one part the only part of it that I sort of sometimes wonder about is that humans do need to look up in some ways. It's very easy to find ourselves, downtrodden by the challenges that we face, and it is always good to have a mind on sort of the bigger picture. That said, there's so much bigger picture work that we can do on the planet. It seems very hard to justify what is currently happening. Even if you can make, you start making the arguments about trickle down innovation and things, which, right now, I wouldn't want to stand up and make that argument. No, so yeah, very difficult. And mostly troubling is my conclusion.
And I think it's interesting that now within management terminology, so whether it's corporate or whether it's third sector or somewhere in between, even in public sector, you see some space related language creeping into management styles. So rather than vision, people are now talking about mission, and that comes from people who have operated in NASA and been part of International Space Station activity about critical mission, and they.
Oh no! I think we've lost Melanie.
Internet did drop earlier. Am I back? Oh, I'm not back.
Melanie obviously can't hear us, so I'll carry on answering some of the questions. The question about innovation background. If you had to choose one technology for the government to heavily invest in, what would it be? So my immediate answer to that, in a way, is that it's not really about investing in one technology, and that any innovation path that is about sort of novelty and technology sort of misses the bigger point, because in a way what we're really looking for is innovation of much wider kind of systems and approaches. And one of the things that I think has been sorely missing from this is innovation in terms of business models and wealth distribution and entirely new ways of approaching problems. I mean, if you look at just one example, one of my favorite examples, the work we've done was we need greener cities, far greener cities. There's no reason why we can't have far more plants and animals in our cities. And they have a hugely beneficial impact, both from climate resilience, so stopping water flowing through cities, to shade, stopping heat. But loads of benefits, as well as that, the reason for just the natural environment, we should be protecting it. But it requires a lot of maintenance. And no one really wants to tackle maintenance as an innovation project. But we did a project where we looked at, how can you employ someone to engage the community and maintain green infrastructure in cities? And so we created what's called the postcode gardener, which was someone who operates at a postcode level. And again, that's about like trying to lock value into communities. It's trying to bring money in, it's trying to bring activity in and join up and connection. And I think far more innovation should be focused on business models and connection than it should be on sort of individual elements of technology, which I realize is slightly sort of dodging your question, but I just think we get far too seduced by technology is going to fix this, like electrical airplanes in the current transport policy that came out this week.
Thank
right.
you. So
now some of them are being upvoted and I can't.
So yeah, that was a question from David on technologies that government should back and focus on, and I would say that there are lots of things that they should be focusing on, and I noticed that lots of things critical to tackling climate change, like our housing heating legislation around heat pumps, all been pushed back to later on in the year. So there are things that we should all be reminding them that they ought to be doing. So we've got another question from
I've got one right at the top, which has just been voted up. Is that, can I take that? And I'll read the question out this time because I keep forgetting to do that. What sort of advice would you give to a university graduate, or perhaps anyone who finds themselves in a similar position you found yourself after graduating, i.e. determined to make an impact regarding the environment, but unsure where to begin? Great question. I mean, I think to the point that I made earlier, the first thing is don't be afraid to go and try a whole range of different things. I think, don't think that you have to kind of set out on the career that's going to save the world. One of the things that working in the environmental movement for however many years it is that you can feel an enormous amount of pressure to create change, and then everywhere you go and try and create the change, you're like, oh, maybe it would be better if I went to go and create change somewhere else. So you can end up, you work in business, and then you're like, oh, well, actually the policy landscape needs to change. So you go and work on policy landscape. Then you're like, okay, the politics needs to change, so the policy can change. So you go and work in grassroots organizing, and then you're like, well, the scale isn't working there, so I need to go and work in innovation. And then and you can find yourself going round and round and round. The really important thing is there's a Japanese concept called Ikegai, which is, what do you have to contribute? What are the skills that you bring? What's needed? What's going to be valued? And to try and experiment around with a range of different things until you find a really good fit. Because if you try and force yourself into a pathway that isn't a good fit, you're not going to create as much. You're not going to contribute as much. So don't be afraid to experiment. Go and try lots of different things, because to the point I made earlier, that range of experience, that range of different approaches really helps when it comes to tackling wicked problems. If you only stand in one career, in one kind of way of looking at the world, then you can end up with almost being blind to what the other possibilities are. So I would definitely recommend that don't worry if you end up doing different things before you end up finding the thing where you can make your best contribution. And then when you do, don't take the burden of the whole world on your shoulders, because it can just crush you, and lots of people are going to burn out in this area. Make sure that you really look after yourself and know that you are trying to do your very best to make the world a better place in your way, and you can't immediately save the world.
So the next upvoted question is about large oil and gas companies like BP and Shell. So they've got a huge impact on the energy industry in terms of reaching net zero. And the question is, can net zero be achieved without their support and them investing in green energy projects? And are they acting fast enough? And
no.
can we believe them? And can we believe them?
Yeah, I mean, right at the moment, we're just working on a big campaign with Friends of the Earth Scotland, which are a separate entity to us, on the Cambio oil field. So a development of a new oil field, which, in the current context just seems completely insane. I think this is one of the most troubling aspects of that industry, is that, despite all the rhetoric around some form of transition, there is still disproportionate and gigantic investment in new oil reserves. And that is just not, there is no way that we can afford, from a carbon budget point of view and to stand a chance of keeping 1.5 alive, that distant possibility that's there, if we start developing any new oil reserves, that is out the window. So no, they are not even working, acting close to fast enough. And at the moment, I can't see a way that's going to be achieved without that industry, essentially shutting down in the next 5 to 10 years, which of course raises a huge just transition issue, because thousands and thousands of people are employed by those organizations. And one of our kind of worries is that there are a lot of kind of low carbon, low job companies. So lots of tech companies, low employment, but low carbon. And what we really need is high employment, low carbon. And so we need industries that are going to replace, those big employers, but in a very low carbon way. And that's a really big challenge.
Agreed. And that's, one of the things that from a Renewable UK perspective, pushing for growth in the supply chain to support those low carbon jobs, but have a volume of jobs that you can have in communities where oil and gas has been quite strong, to try and absorb some of that, although obviously it can't take everybody. We've had another question in from Nicholas Thompson, who says, if you look at the rhetoric coming from government and business, it seems everyone is on board with a net zero transition. Though I'm sure the reality is not so simple, you're right. What worries you as what worries you most as powerful obstacles to a net zero transition, which I guess links in very well with the BP and Shell point?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, you could argue that this government is the strongest on climate, and they have put out a lot of plans and rhetoric, and as you say, so everyone seems on board with the net zero transition. And I genuinely think that in places that is absolutely true. There are people who are in government who are really passionate about that change. That said, there is still just a mass. The thing I'm most worried about is the gap between the rhetoric and the action, and in particular, the action in terms of being fair. So the more that we rely on technology to save us, and the more that we don't take into account those who are kind of marginalized or oppressed or left out or at risk, the more, morally that is just completely untenable. But also politically, look what happens when we fail to address those things. It is the thing that's most troubling to me is the gap between what needs to happen and also those who are in danger of being left behind. And that is the thing that concerns me most, because we've seen a lot of political instability already in the last 10 years. We need political stability both nationally and internationally to be able to enact the huge changes that we need to take into account, need to do. So that means we really need to make sure that we deal with all the inequality and injustice in the system. And I don't feel like the current government is doing anywhere close to enough. And if you look at their position on transport that came out this week, there is a lot of 70% of flights are taken by 15% of people. Most people agree that there should be some kind of constraint of those who fly the most. And yet you don't really see any of that kind of rhetoric coming out of government. There's much more reliance on kind of technologies just going to enable us to carry on flying the way we always have. That just isn't really grounded in reality, and it doesn't take into account that 30% of people don't fly at all and don't create much impact. And we should be making sure that we're looking after those people rather than protecting the small percentage of people who fly once a month.
And if we can come to Joseph's question next, where he's asking why are corporations so stubborn to change to eco-friendly operation? I mean, some of that is political environment and challenging that stubbornness and forcing the hand of some of that stubbornness. Is that the way forward? Do you think increased regulation is the way forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. It is very interesting to watch the car industry as an example of this. If, when you're developing something that has, 10-year timelines, if the government sets incredibly clear targets, then industry can adjust. And it's one of the things that where we're really letting down farmers who are struggling already, is the fact we're not giving them a really clear sense of what the future is going to look like and how their livelihoods are going to be supported. So in terms of corporations, I do think government setting very clear ambitions. So for example, around getting rid of internal combustion engine cars by a certain date really does help. That said, from my experience of working with a range of corporations, often what tends to happen internally is that you'll have very strong ambitions that are led often from the top of the organization and people feel very passionate about. But it tends to get into the sort of middle layer of the organization, and there is a huge pressure on those people to continue to deliver to traditional corporate targets. And so they feel unable to make any genuinely transformational change within their business. And so, one of the, in a way, nothing can change until everything changes within the organization. And while we're still trapped by things like delivering shareholder value on a short-term cycle, very few of those businesses are going to be able to make the transformational shift that's required to be able to deliver, what we need, what we genuinely need, rather than what we consume within planetary boundaries.
Thank you. Now we're drawing to the close now. I rather than come to the questions, thank you all so much, by the way, for your questions. They're great, and we will try and capture these, and maybe we can be cheeky and email them to Hugh and see if he could just drop a quick note back to us to come back to you. Is there anything that you'd like to say in closing, Hugh, just as a final message to our attendees today, and then I'll just wrap up with a reminder of what's coming later on in the afternoon.
So there's one question which I would like to sort of draw attention to, which is part of a much bigger question, and that's around social media. And I think one of the things that the progressive sort of environmental movement isn't taking into account nearly enough is the impact of technology. And that is both from the fact of we have precious little, we all have little attention, a resource of attention, whether that's individually or whether that's as a society. And what we pay attention to is hugely important. If we have very limited resources, we better be damn sure where we're applying that attention. And I think part of the problem at the moment is we have, highly addictive, digital environments which distract us an awful lot. And work environments that are very distracting, and we need kind of deep, creative, analytical work. We need to pay attention to the problems that really affect us, not paying attention to whatever outrage is sweeping through social media at the time. They can be very useful tools, but I think we have to be very, very mindful of the impact that they're having, in particular because Facebook's business model has been shown to increase polarization. And we need less polarization for the transition that we need. So paying very careful attention to that. What really changes people is not like whether they've seen something on social media, but it's often stories from the right people in their communities, in their close personal networks. And so I think, use them, but be very, very mindful of what you're asking people to pay attention to, and beware of outrage on social media. Most of the time it's outrage rather than actual, it's perceived outrage rather than actual as well. Filtering the noise, it's an important skill. Hugh, thank you so much. We are going to have to leave it there. Your contributions have been really insightful and brilliant questions from you as our audience. We will see you back here in 15 minutes time. We have got Q&A with graduate scheme participants, people who've been working in renewables who should be around about your age. So again, you can get interactive with them. And we have an exhibition for you at 3:30 until 4:15. So you can go and join chat rooms and attend the stands to speak to representatives of those companies for a bit more information. But for now, thank you so much. And thank you for your time this morning, Hugh. Well, thank you so much, and thanks for all the great questions. There were so many good questions in there. I wish I could spend more time looking at them.